This region had been a permanent settlement area of Eurasian steppe peoples for centuries, which appeared in the writings of ancient historians like Herodot. However, a collective name like Scythians would distort the real relations among the ethnic groups. Thus, in the 5th century, the scholar Priscus of Panium reported that the Saragas and Arnagas arrived at the Eastern Roman in Constantinople and asked him for help. They had been driven out of their homeland on the Black Sea by the Sabes, who in turn had been the victims of an attack by the Avars, who had extended their empire into Western Asia and were teeling to settle there. We can conclude that the influence of Turkic culture already reached deep into Eastern Europe when the Ashina arrived there. Because the Arnagas as well as the Saragas were part of the Oghur Federation, which in turn was a branch of the Turkic Tila Confederation. This would explain the absence of any sources on the battles of the Gokturks in their expansion into Europe. There were simply no battles to record. The Turks from East Asia did not fight the Turks in the West, and yet, or perhaps because of this, were able to integrate them so quickly into their empire. But when Istemi's armies arrived in Eastern Europe, they were on the trail of another ethnic group. A band of refugees who had tried to seek safety from the Turks. The Rouran. While their ruling dynasty took refuge in northern China, most of the lower nobility, including the knights, headed for Western Asia. In the process, they encountered and mingled with the Avars, who probably had ties to the Rouran. Due to thin sources, Rouran and Avars cannot be equated, but it can very well be assumed that the Rouran refugees took control over the Avars. Therefore, within a short period of time, the Avars developed from a tribal federation to a khaganate. The title of Khagan, which now actually belonged to the Gokturks, was claimed and continued by the Rouran in Europe. Therefore, the Turks were after them. A correspondence between Istemi and Byzantium further reveals that these Avars were well known to the Gokturks. Before their tribe could rise to a great empire, the Avars had to consolidate their rule over the Slavic and partly Germanic tribes, and for this they needed a promise of protection from Byzantium. In doing so, however, they were pursued by Istemi's retaliatory troops. In a message to Emperor Maurikios, he let it be known what he intended to do with the Avars. The Byzantines, in turn, hoped to mobilize the Turks against their archenemy Persia in the east. The centuries-long wars between Byzantium and Persia were like a tug-of-war for supremacy in the Middle East, and the Turks became an important factor in this confrontation. But the Avars had successfully driven a wedge between the Turks and the Eastern Romans. There was no rapprochement between the Turks and Byzantines. After consolidating Turkic rule in Kazakhstan and parts of Eastern Europe, Istemi turned to Bactria and Sogdia, the gateways to the Middle East. South of the Hephthalites, in Iran, the Sassanids, who had established a new Persian empire after the collapse of the Parthian Empire, were just waiting to re-establish their historical dominance over Transoxiana. The Sassanids and Hephthalites were therefore hostile to each other. Then, shortly before the outbreak of hostilities between the Persians and Huns, the Gokturks arrived in the area. Like the Byzantine emperor, the Persian king now turned his attention to this new great power. The Turks, under the banner of the Gokturk Khaganate, were militarily more tightly organized than ever before. All the smaller tribes in the area now pooled their military capacities, and could march at Istemi's command. But in the event of Istemi's conquest of Sogdia and Bactria, the Turks could have closed the Silk Road to Persian or Byzantine traders at will at any time. Therefore, the Sassanids secretly approached Istemi, and made him a proposal he could not refuse. On the other side of the continent, intrigues were afoot that would decisively shape the political future of East Asia for the next 200 years. The Qi dynasty, fearing an invasion by the Gokturks, had a 400-kilometer wall built along the border with the Khaganate. At the same time, the Qi housed high-ranking Rouran dynasty members. The neighboring Wei dynasty, on the other hand, had immediately handed over Rouran refugees who arrived on its territory to the Gokturks. There had been a cold war between Wei and Qi for some time, and the Gokturks played a central role during this conflict as a third faction, similar to the situation in the Middle East. Despite walls and state borders, the traffic of merchants and traders was relatively borderless in those days. Kara, the new Khagan of the Gokturks, took the title of Issyk, and led a campaign against Dengzhou, the leader of the Rouran. Emperor Wenshuan, himself descended from the Turco-Mongols Yan Bey, had offered Dengzhou and his family protection from the Turks. In February of the year 553, however, Deng Zhu was forced by Wen Xuan to go into battle against the Gokturks himself, thus maintaining Qi influence on the steppe. In the spring, Deng Zhu marched into Mongolia, but Isik Khagan was able to overwhelm his army and defeated them in the Battle of Ordos. After months of intrigues within the Rouran dynasty, Anlu Okan, the last son of Anagui, assumed the position of leader on the orders of Emperor Wen Xuan. Al-Nushan, incidentally, was a son-in-law of the emperor. Taking advantage of this family alliance, the Qi emperor hoped to persuade the Rouran to attack the Turks again. But Anlauchan realized how he was being used as a pawn and rebelled against Qi rule. He led 50,000 men into battle in September, but was defeated by the imperial army. Wen Xuan again repelled a second Rouran attack in the winter, and had some 30,000 Rouran members captured. Women and children were sent into slavery. The Qi had defeated the Rouran, but exhaustion had gradually set in due to the exertions of recent years. Apart from the misguided strategy of Wen Xuan, a permanent alcoholic, their geopolitical position was deteriorating massively. And the Gokturks under the banner of Isik had, for their part, secured the borders with the northern Chinese states, and furthermore prevented a return of their former feudal lords to the steppes. At that very moment, Isik died. Circumstance of his death? Allegedly an illness. Fortunately, a state crisis was averted after Mukan, the next eldest son of Bumin, ascended the throne with the support of the nobility, and stabilized the political situation in the year 554. In the following years, Mukan pursued an active foreign policy by destroying the remnants of the Rouran in the northwest, and subjugating the stubborn Kyrgyz on the Yenisei. The Kyrgyz were known for their mining, and were now supplying the Gokturks with gold deposits. Shortly thereafter, Mukan also conquered Khitan territory, and integrated these Proto-Mongols into his empire. The power of the Turkic Empire grew rapidly in a short time. In 554 or 555, the empire of the Gokturks was already twice as large as the legendary steppe empire of the Asian Huns. And thanks to the Sogdians' assured supply of gold and iron and control of trade along the Silk Road, the Khaganate became increasingly attractive to merchants and traders from around the world. The Turks increasingly hosted diplomats and religious pilgrims from India, Tibet, and China. Although the Sogdians lived in the western part of the empire, they had already opened trade routes to China while the Huns still ruled over the steppe peoples. After the establishment of the Turkic Empire, more and more of them flocked to the east. Gradually, Sogdian merchants settled in Ochukan and on the Altai, and took over administrative activities in the service of Mukan. The Sogdians became intermediaries for the Turks in their disputes with the Chinese. In the process, they also lent the Turks their script, which later became the Old Turkic script. Thus, the national alphabet of the Turks was born. Almost at the same time, the Western Wei collapsed. They were replaced by the Northern Zhou under the leadership of Yuan Tai, Bumin's acquaintance. Yuan Tai had been active in the service of the Western Wei as a high-ranking general for 20 years. He died in 557 after the establishment of his own empire. His two successors each died after a short time. It was not until Emperor Wu took office that a prolonged period of stability began in the Zhou Empire. Under these circumstances, Emperor Wu pursued a more offensive foreign policy against the rival Northern Qi dynasty. To achieve his goals, he needed the help of the Turks, with whom Emperor Wu had reaffirmed the alliance shortly after coming to power. He made the following proposal to Mukan. Turks and Zhou Chinese would go to war against the Qi. The Turks would be allowed to keep their booty. In return, Mukan would bequeath one of his daughters to Emperor Wu. Mukan agreed. Thus, both rulers linked their family alliance with their geopolitical interests. In the west the Byzantines and Avars, in the south the Huns and Persians, in the east the Koreans and Chinese. After a period of success, difficult geopolitical times were ahead. The fate of the empire, and its inhabitants, was now in the hands of Istemi and Mukan. The 560s began for the Gokturks with two major military conflicts. The first took place in Transoxiana after Istemi's troops marched as far as Bukhara. Turks and Huns fought each other for 7 days and 7 nights in a massive battle. On the 8th day, the Turks captured the Ark, a citadel and ruling palace of Bukhara, wresting the city from Hunnic control. Later, it would turn out that Istemi had held a secret rendezvous with the Persian king Khosrow, shortly before the battle. both had agreed on a joint war against the White Huns. When the Turks entered Bukhara from the northeast, Persian soldiers from the southwest marched in at the same time. Thus, the White Huns were attacked in from both sides, and quite frankly annihilated. Bukhara went to the Turks. After Istemi established his rule over the trading city, he learned that the Hunnic nobility had left the area before the battle, and fled to Afghanistan. There they crowned a man named Faginish as their king. But after the Persians invaded there as well, Faginish became distressed, and had to submit his people to the rule of the superior Persians. Istemi then changed his attitude toward the Huns, and offered Faginish both refuge and a piece of land in the Khaganate. Faginish accepted, and so the remaining Hephthalites became Istemi's vassals. They were allowed to retain lesser Hunnic royal titles, and were only required to recognize the authority of the Ashina dynasty. Istemi thus integrated Hunnic warriors into his army, and with the conquest of Sogdia, deprived the Persians of an important source of power. In the following years, many Turks settled in the cities along the Silk Road, including Tashkent and Samarkand, so that they came into close contact with the Sogdians, a people consisting mainly of merchants, traders, and diplomats. The surrounding region is now known as Turkestan, the land of the Turks, who rose to become the dominant culture in the centuries that followed. While the Gokturks were still in power, there was a real economic boom in Central Asia. Chinese reports show that agriculture, manufactures, and trade of the mainly Iranian natives in the west of the Khaganate experienced a new heyday. The Gokturks also financially supported the development of infrastructure. For example, sewage systems in Sogdia were repaired after decades of wars. The Tashkent region of Kyrgyzstan also saw technical advances in pottery and glazing. However, after the White Huns were defeated, the Khaganate bordered the Persian Empire for the first time. The border remained unsettled. In addition, there was the question of control of the trade routes leading to East Asia. The battle for the Silk Road had just begun. Meanwhile, in the east, Mukan joined the Zhou dynasty in the war against the Qi dynasty. The southern front was led by Zhou general Daxi Wu. His goal was to capture the border town of Pingyang. In the north, a combined Turkic-Chinese army attacked. The Turkic warriors joined forces with an army of Chinese led by Yang Zhong. The combined force then marched into the Qi area, and advanced to Taiyuan. The northern Qi, led by Emperor Wucheng, could not withstand the onslaught of the Zhou and Gokturks. However, Wucheng did not stand by idly. He instructed the legendary general, Hulu Guang, to stop the Zhou attack in the south. At the same time, Wucheng himself marched off to Taiyuan with an army to repel Yang Zhong and the Turks. When he entered the city, he was so impressed by the strength of the enemy soldiers, that he initially wanted to flee the battlefield. Only at the urging of some high-ranking princes did Wucheng turn back, and face his enemies. The Qi were unable to drive out the attacking army, but were able to hold Taiyuan for the time being. The city was then besieged by the Turkic army in the winter of 563-564, but never fully brought under control. It was not until the following spring that Wucheng was able to turn the tide, and force the Zhou Gokturk army to retreat. At the same time, Hulu Guang's forces were victorious over Daxi in the south. Thus, the first offensive of the Gokturks and the Zhou Empire had failed to meet expectations. Daxi led a second offensive the following year. This time, the Qi Emperor Wucheng ordered the two generals Duan and Hulu to protect Luoyang from the Zhou onslaught. Indeed, the combined Qi army quickly defeated the forces of Daxi. While Hulu could rejoice in the rise of his prestige and a title awarded by the emperor, Wucheng had to worry about the fact that it had been mainly the Gokturks who had attacked and successfully plundered the Taiyuan area. The Turks had retreated without suffering any casualties, and they had not even joined the second offensive, while the Zhou only narrowly lost the battle. In the end, the Ashina and Zhou dynasties sent signs of strength to the Qi, and the Turks asserted themselves as a major power in the region. Both wars, in Afghanistan as well as in China, had a tremendous impact on the political course of the following 2 decades. As an indirect consequence, the Turks came to control the Silk Road in the medium term, a road that actually consisted of many smaller trade roads, which in turn spanned 2 continents. For the longest time, the notorious commodity, silk, had been exclusively cultivated in East Asia. Later, the Persians also gained access to this luxury good, which was used primarily for the production of high-quality textiles. Besides silk, cotton, spices, minerals and other valuable goods were also transported and traded. Trade was carried out by merchants who acted as private individuals along the trading posts. But trade was sometimes associated with customs duties. An estate that had the military upper hand along the trading post could trade to merchants from certain countries. After the Battle of Bukhara, the Persian court was considering how the Turks could harm Persian trade, for example, by denying access to Persian merchants to create economic pressure. A distinctive feature of Turkic rule, however, is the fact that they did not plunder or even wipe out the cities along the trade routes, as the Mongols would do some 700 years later. Instead, they incorporated these cities into their khaganate, and in some cases took over their administration. Istemi appears to have been a diplomatically savvy and intelligent politician, as he managed to establish his rule over Transoxiana without causing resentment among the inhabitants toward the Turks. Istemi did not interfere in the religion, culture, or economy of the locals. Instead, he integrated individual personalities into his system of vassals, deputies, advisors, and courtiers. This form of indirect rule was common among Turkic empires. But Istemi had great ambitions. Conversely, the Sogdians had already made plans to expand their influence along the Silk Road with the help of the Gokturks. They wanted to increase trade with the Byzantine Empire. But first they had to obtain permission from the Persian king to pass through Persian territory in order to reach Anatolia. The skepticism of each other was mutual. Fearing that Istemi was secretly preparing an invasion of Sassanid territory, Khosrow personally marched one day with a large army to the border region of Tabaristan, also called Gurgan, on the southern coast of the Caspian Sea. And indeed, there he met Istemi in person, who seemed as if he had already been expecting Khosrow. The Turks had passed the Oxus and were not in front of, but already behind, the gates of the Iranian highlands. Khosrow kept calm and presented Istemi with numerous gifts. Presumably they were celebrating a joint feast. In the process, Khosrow managed to persuade Istemi to hand over his Hun vassal Faganish to the Persian capital. As a result of the agreement, part of the Hephthalites became a vassal state of the Sassanids. In return for this exchange of vassals, the Gokturks agreed with the Persians to draw a border along the Oxus River. The Persians also renounced their claim to Sogdia. To seal the agreement, Istemi bequeathed one of his daughters to Khosrow as a bride. The relationship of this Turkish princess with the Persian king later produced Hormizd IV. The peaceful coexistence was shaken one day due to an incident. The leaders of the Sogdian trade guilds had asked Istemi to travel to the Persian court in Ctesiphon. They wanted to obtain permission there to cross Persian territory. Istemi reluctantly agreed. But given the well-developed roads along the Silk Road, it had been easier to send envoys on their way through Iran to Anatolia rather than have them cross the steppes in Ukraine. When Sogdian ambassadors arrived in the Persian capital, Khosrow accepted the gifts they had brought and had all their goods bought up. However, to the delegation's dismay, the goods were set on fire in the open street. After Istemi sent a second delegation to Ctesiphon, Khosrow even had the Sogdians poisoned this time. This was clearly an open threat to Sogdians and Turks alike. There was no passage for Sogdian traders to Anatolia, and thus no possibility for the Turks to establish relations with Byzantium via the southern land route. Shortly after the incident, a Sogdian named Maniak paid Istemi a visit at court. Maniak was an influential merchant and politician in Bukhara, and asked Istemi to send an envoy under his own leadership directly to Byzantium. According to Maniak's plan, the Sogdians would bypass the Persian market by taking the more dangerous route across the Volga River, where the Turkic-speaking Arnagas, Bulgarians, and other tribal federations lived. He wanted to propose to the Byzantines a political alliance with the Khaganate. Istemi agreed to the plans. In 568, Maniak traveled to Constantinople, where he and his friends were warmly received by Emperor Justin II. Byzantium and Persia had made peace for the time being, but the emperor was still interested in an alliance with the rising Turkic Empire. Here the envoys learned that the Byzantines had had the means to produce silk themselves since 555. In what was probably the first case of economic espionage ever, two Sogdians had smuggled silkworms from Khotan and the Gokturk Khaganate to Constantinople on behalf of Emperor Justinian. Nevertheless, Maniac saw the point of his trip to the land of the Eastern Romans, as alliance building was the top priority. The following year, a diplomatic envoy led by the high-ranking Byzantine general Zamarkos, and accompanied by Maniac, left Constantinople on its way back to the Khaganate. Istemi received Zamarkos in Bukhara and treated him kindly, almost brotherly. According to Menander Protector's records, Istemi, who is also referred to as Sizabulos, rested on a golden throne that had 2 wheels, so that horses could pull it. However, Istemi received the envoys 2 more times, always at one of his other courts, all decorated with silk and gold. Zamarkos was amazed and impressed at the power and wealth of the Turks. But his mission, and Istemi's desire, were clearly pragmatic. The new alliance was defensive in nature. Should one of the 2 allies be attacked, by whomever that is, the other would have to come to the military aid of its ally. By 576, 5 more Byzantine legations had arrived at the court of Istemi, all of which fell victim to raids by Persian mercenaries on the way. But it was already too late, as the alliance between the Gokturks and the Byzantine Empire had been consolidated. The diplomatic reports of the Byzantines, moreover, provide information about the social structure of Turkic society. The position and role of women, as already mentioned, was different from what we might imagine today. The Khagans and begs of the empire did not take several wives or even concubines, as polygamy was completely unusual and frowned upon among the ancient Turks. Only later, after the disintegration of the empire, and at the beginning of the Islamization of the Turks, polygamy was increasingly practiced. The envoys were surprised above all by the power of certain Turkic women. According to Menander, a Byzantine delegation on its way to the Khaganate crossed a land called Akagas, which was named after a woman who ruled independently over the tribes living there. The role of the Turkic woman in history is also evident elsewhere. The alliance that the Gokturks had made with the Zhou in East Asia was linked to the marriage of Mukun's daughter to Emperor Wu. But the lost war against the Qi changed the political climate. In the spring of 565, Wu sent a delegation of 120 people, led by Yuan Chun, to the Gokturk territory. The plan was to escort Mukun's daughter to Zhou territory, and crown her empress. Mukun refused, and detained Yuan Chun's delegation. A few years later, a great storm inflicted heavy damage on Mukun's golden tent. The Khagan took this as a sign of divine disapproval for his revocation of the marriage offer, and in return allowed Yuan Chun's delegation to escort his daughter to the Zhou court. When the daughter and princess of Turkic descent arrived in the Zhou capital Chang'an, she was personally welcomed by Emperor Wu, and made his empress. At least, this is how it happened according to Chinese chronicles. The veracity of this story must not be assumed in its entirety, for it imposes on the Turks a stereotype that the Chinese often cultivated about nomadic peoples. Mukun is portrayed throughout the chronology of the Chinese as a powerful and courageous ruler, but from the perspective we have just illustrated, he was also stubborn and naive. So were the Huns prior to the Turks, supposedly. Only after a great storm did he realize his mistake, and the Chinese emperor, unlike Mukun, was merciful and did not hold a grudge. This was obviously written in favor of the emperor. Nevertheless, it is a historical fact that the Turkic princess entered the service of the emperor and became an empress. She is described in the sources as immensely beautiful, and always appropriate in her actions. Interestingly, Emperor Wu does not seem to have favored her personally, as there were other women at his court who were ethnically Chinese, and thus first class. It was only after Lady Dou intervened that he treated her more favorably in day-to-day politics. Lady Dou was the emperor's niece. She wanted her uncle to show greater favor to the empress, to appease her home state, and to be able to pull them more strongly to the side of the Zhou. This speaks volumes about the connection between the young Turkic women and her family, the Ashina. She proved to be the main link, and guarantee, of the Gokturk-Zhou alliance. At the Zhou court, they gave her the name Empress Ashina. In 578, Emperor Wu died, and his son, Yuan Yun, ascended the throne as Emperor Xian. He honored Empress Ashina as an Empress Dowager. This basically meant that even though Empress Ashina was a widow, she remained at the Chang'an court, and was given preferential treatment by everyone else. She had basically risen one rank in the court's social hierarchy. After his death, she was again honored by his successor, this time as Great Empress Dowager. Shortly thereafter, the Zhou dynasty was usurped by Emperor Xian's father-in-law, Yang Jian, who as Emperor Wen, would establish the powerful and infamous Sui dynasty. He had most of the courtiers in Chang'an killed, but Empress Ashina was not to be harmed. This seems to have been a strategic decision on Wen's part, as he did not want to mess with the Turks, for the time being. A year later, in 582, Empress Ashina died. She had just turned 31. She was buried on April 29, and has recently attracted the interest of contemporary historians and archaeologists alike. Her tomb, discovered in 1993 in Xinjiang, in East Turkestan, has been looted several times, but some of the artifacts, including a certain seal, have been preserved. The Golden Seal of Empress Ashina is the first medieval example of the Golden Seal script. While this script was invented sometime during the Han Dynasty a few centuries earlier, it came back into use during the Zhou Dynasty. Mukan was inherited by Taspa, another son of Bumin. Taspa was now ruler of a walled empire. At one point, the Khagan referred to the Chinese emperors as his sons. However, upon assuming office, he took upon himself an enormous responsibility. As the undisputed leader of all Turkic people, he had a wide range of military and political tools at his disposal. At that time, the Khaganate already covered some 6 million square kilometers. Therefore, organizational changes had to be made. In the first year of his rule, Taspa appointed his nephews, Ishbara and Boru, as lesser Khagans. Then, he turned his attention to the changing geopolitical situation in China. The once proud regents of the northern Qi dynasty had been conquered by the Zhou within a year. But the Zhou were not the only ones with political and military power. When they controlled almost the entire border to the Gokturks, Taspa made a logical decision. He switched his alliance partner. After 30 years of friendship with the Zhou, he wanted to support their rivals to prevent a unified Chinese state and keep the balance of power in his favor. The Zhou had simply become too powerful. However, declaring war on them would have been disadvantageous. Factors that militated against this were free trade along the Eastern Silk Road and the presence of Empress Ashina at the Zhou court. Instead, Taspa capitalized on the desperation of one Xiaoyi, noble of the Qi, who had tried in vain with his troops to prevent Zhou rule. Supporting him was a subtle way to build pressure on the Zhou. The Qi Empire had a difficult time in the face of attacks by the Turks and Zhou. Only under Emperor Huzhu did a period of stability begin. Nevertheless, he is blamed in Chinese history books for the rise of corruption and financial lavishness. Linked to this emperor is the key figure in this conflict, Hulu Guang, commander-in-chief of the Qi army. This man, who had recently defended his homeland against the Turks, died as a result of a palace conspiracy by Huzhu's intervention. And the general's assassination indirectly ushered in the downfall of the Qi. When the Zhou invaded the Qi in 577, the other generals were unable to repel the attack. This series of events spurred Xiaoyi into action. When the young prince arrived in May, the locals welcomed him and supported the resistance movement. Xiaoyi led them into battle with his loyal troops. In 577, Xiaoyi's army attacked Jinyang. The attack was unsuccessful. The situation worsened when the Zhou launched a counterattack. The resistance movement was then forced to retreat to Mei. Within a few days, the Zhou army arrived there as well. Their general Shenju defeated Xiaoyi in a battle and forced him to flee. This was reason enough for Xiaoyi to leave his homeland for good. When he arrived at the court of Taspa, he had a reputation to repair. He wanted to become emperor of the northern Qi, and then ruler over all of northern China. At that time, Taspa was nothing less than the most influential man in all of Eurasia, and the most powerful ruler in the world. Perhaps, he had not earned this reputation, for Taspa had followed in the footsteps of his brother Mukan. And now he welcomed someone from a family that had fought for everything the Ashina dynasty had stood for, from the very beginning, an independent Turkic